Catherine Pembroke had not been touched by her husband in 11 months. Not a hand on her waist, not a glance across the dinner table, not even a word when she walked into a room. Duke Xavier Lancaster had a way of looking through her, like she was a window, and the real view was whatever lay beyond it. Always something beyond it. His ledgers, his horses, his mother's voice in his ear. Anyone but her. She still wore his ring. She still sat at the head of the East table during banquets, still signed correspondence as Duchess of Lancaster Hall, still curtsied when required, and smiled when expected. But the staff had started serving her last. The seamstress had stopped asking for her opinion on the children's clothes. Even the dogs followed Xavier now, not her, as if they too had sensed which one of them mattered in this house. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a great many things that weren't true. Tonight, the dining hall was full, visiting lords, their wives, a senator from the capital. Catherine sat in her usual chair, spine straight, hands folded, while Xavier laughed at the other end of the table with a woman who wasn't his wife. Lady Genevieve Ashcombe, beautiful, loud, the kind of woman men noticed without trying. Catherine noticed too. She noticed everything. That was the curse of being invisible. You saw all of it, and none of it saw you back. Your Grace. A servant leaned toward her, voice low. Should I have your plate cleared? She hadn't touched her food.
Yes,
She said, Thank you. Across the table, Xavier didn't look up. He hadn't looked at her once all evening. Not when she entered, not when she spoke to the senator's wife in flawless French, not even when his own daughter, 6 years old and small for her age, climbed onto Catherine's lap halfway through dinner because no one else had thought to notice the child was tired. That was the thing nobody understood about Catherine Pembroke. She wasn't absent. She wasn't weak. She ran this household down to the last candle and coin, while everyone assumed she did nothing at all. She knew which tenant farms were behind on rent before the steward did. She knew Xavier's mother was quietly selling off heirlooms to cover gambling debts nobody was supposed to know about. She knew things. She simply wasn't asked. Lady Genevieve's laugh rang out again, bright and careless, and this time Xavier looked at her like she was the only woman in the room. Catherine stood, quietly, smoothing her skirts. Are you leaving already, my dear? Xavier's mother asked, not really caring. I have letters to finish, Catherine said, and smiled. The same smile she always wore. Pleasant, practiced, empty. Nobody at that table understood what was behind it. Nobody ever did. The Lancaster Charity Gala was the one night a year the entire province gathered under one roof. Nobles, merchants, the press. Catherine had organized it for 6 years running. Flowers, seating, menu, music. Nobody thanked her for it. Nobody ever did. She wore deep emerald that night, the color Xavier once said suited her well enough. She'd held onto that line for years like it meant something. It hadn't. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and old money. Catherine moved through it, the way she moved through everything now. Present, composed, unseen. She greeted the mayor's wife. She complimented a senator's daughter on her engagement. She checked, twice, that the orchestra had the right program. Then Xavier arrived, with Lady Genevieve Ashcombe on his arm. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. 300 pairs of eyes did the work silently, sliding from the Duke's confident smile to his wife, standing 20 feet away, with a champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Genevieve wore red, bold, deliberate red, the kind that said, "Look at me," in a room where Catherine had spent the evening trying not to be looked at. Xavier, his mother's voice, sharp under her breath. Not here. He didn't lower his voice to match. She's a guest, Mother, like everyone else. Like everyone else. Catherine heard it from across the room, clear as a bell over the string quartet. She set her glass down. Steady hands. She'd practiced steady hands for 11 months. Xavier crossed the floor toward her. Not to apologize, not to explain, but because protocol demanded the Duke greet his Duchess first, a formality he clearly resented performing. Catherine, flat, bored. The gala looks well. It does, she said. I planned it. I know. He didn't know. He'd never asked. Behind him, Genevieve laughed at something one of the young lords said, and Xavier's attention drifted there before Catherine had finished her sentence. He didn't notice he'd done it. That was the worst part. He didn't even notice anymore. Your Grace, the senator's wife said too loudly, leaning toward Catherine with the particular cruelty of a woman who enjoyed other people's wreckage. Is it true the Duke is considering Lady Ashcombe for the spring hunt party? As hostess, the question landed like a slap. Spring hunt party. Catherine had hosted it every year of her marriage. Xavier didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all. The silence stretched long enough for half the room to draw their own conclusions, and judging by the way conversation dimmed around them, they had. Catherine felt the old, familiar heat rise in her chest. Not embarrassment, something colder, recognition. This was what 11 months had built toward. Not a single explosive betrayal, but 100 small ones, stacked until they became unmistakable in front of everyone she knew. How wonderful, Catherine said, voice even, that Lady Ashcombe has so much free time. A few nearby guests laughed. Careful, polite laughter, unsure which side was safe to land on. Xavier's jaw tightened. Catherine, enjoy the gala, Your Grace. She turned before he could finish, skirts sweeping behind her, chin level, spine straight. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked, slow and deliberate, past every whispering cluster of nobility, out through the tall glass doors into the cold night air, where no one could see her hands finally start to shake. Behind her, the music played on without missing a note. Nobody had noticed she'd left. That, she thought, was exactly the problem. By morning, the story had already traveled. Catherine knew it the moment she stepped into the breakfast room, and the maids fell silent. Servants always knew before the family did. They'd heard it from the gala staff, who'd heard it from the guests, who'd watched the Duke ignore his wife in front of 300 people and draw no comfortable conclusions about what that meant. She sat at her usual place, poured her own tea since no one moved to do it, and ate her toast as if the world hadn't shifted overnight. Xavier's mother arrived first, settling into her chair with the particular stiffness of a woman preparing to say something unwelcome. You made a scene, she said. I left a room, Catherine said, quietly. I believe that's the opposite of a scene. People are talking. People always talk. Usually about Lady Ashcombe's hemlines. I imagine they'll move on. The older woman's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to Catherine answering back. For 11 months, Catherine had answered with silence, with composure, with the small, unreadable smile that made everyone in this house slightly uneasy without knowing why. That smile. It was the only thing Catherine had left that was entirely hers, and she guarded it like a weapon. When Xavier entered, late, jaw tight, clearly having slept badly, he found his wife exactly where she always was, calm, unbothered, smiling, faintly, at nothing in particular. It unsettled him more than tears would have. We need to discuss last night, he said. Do we? Catherine took a sip of tea. I thought you handled it quite well. You said nothing. I said even less. Lady Ashcombe seemed to enjoy herself. Catherine. Yes? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd expected something else from her. Anger, perhaps. Or tears. Something he could manage. Something that fit the shape of every argument they'd ever had. Instead, he got that smile, polite as a closed door, and it threw him completely. You're not going to say anything about it? He asked, almost accusing, as though her silence were the offense, and not the gala itself. What would you like me to say? That you're upset? Would it change anything if I were? He had no answer for that. Of course it wouldn't. They both knew it. His mother cleared her throat, eager to redirect. The spring hunt party invitations need sending. I assume, given everything, Lady Ashcombe will... I'll send them, Catherine said, setting down her cup with quiet finality. I always do. A flicker crossed Xavier's face. Something close to confusion, the recognition that his wife had just calmly reasserted a position He'd been on the verge of stripping from her in front of the entire province, and done it so simply there was nothing to argue against. "Fine," he said, because there was nothing else to say. Catherine smiled again, wider this time, almost kind. It was the smile that would haunt him for months, not because it was cold, but because it wasn't. There was no performance in it, no bitterness dressed up as grace. It was the smile of a woman who had already decided something he hadn't been told. She rose from the table, smoothing her skirts the way she always did, and paused at the door. Xavier. He looked up, almost hopeful, as if she might finally give him the fight he'd been bracing for. "The hunt party will be lovely," she said instead. "I'll make sure of it. I always do." She left him sitting there, coffee cooling, Mother watching him with poorly concealed alarm, utterly unable to explain why his wife's pleasant, ordinary smile had just made his stomach drop, like the floor had opened beneath him. He didn't know it yet, but it had. She'd already begun making arrangements no one in that house knew about. The smile wasn't surrender. It was a door closing, and Xavier Lancaster was standing on the wrong side of it. The west wing of Lancaster Hall had been Catherine's since her wedding day. Her sitting room, her study, the nursery where her children had taken their first steps. For 11 years it had hummed with life, even when the rest of the house felt cold toward her. 3 days after the gala, Xavier walked past it and noticed, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, how quiet it had become. He told himself it meant nothing. Catherine often kept to herself in the mornings, but by the second week, the quiet had a different quality, not peaceful, but absent. The curtains stayed drawn. The candles in her study went unlit. Her favorite mare hadn't been ridden. "Where is the Duchess?" he finally asked a maid, trying to sound indifferent and failing. "Visiting her sister, Your Grace, in Ashford." He hadn't known she had business in Ashford. He hadn't known much about Catherine's life at all, he realized, standing there foolishly waiting for an explanation that wasn't owed to him. Days passed. The children asked for her, little Eleanor most of all, the one who'd climbed into Catherine's lap at dinner like it was the most natural thing in the world. Xavier found himself answering questions he had no answers to. "When is Mother coming back? Why didn't she take us? Did you make her leave?" He hadn't made her leave. He told himself that. He told himself that often. The estate ledgers, normally organized in Catherine's careful hand, sat untouched on the study desk. Xavier opened them out of boredom one evening and found a complexity he hadn't expected. Tenant accounts, repair schedules, a list of overdue payments from his own mother that made his stomach turn cold. Catherine had been managing all of it, quietly, without credit, without complaint. He'd assumed she did nothing all day. He'd assumed wrong, and the ledgers made that humiliatingly clear. Lady Genevieve visited twice that week, draped herself across the drawing-room sofa, laughed at his jokes, asked pointed questions about poor Catherine, with a sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. Xavier found he couldn't laugh back. The house felt wrong around her, too loud where Catherine had always been quiet, too bright where Catherine had brought a kind of order he hadn't appreciated until it vanished. "You seem distracted," Genevieve said, watching him stare at the empty hallway leading to the west wing. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. At night, he caught himself walking past her sitting room out of habit, half expecting to see her at the writing desk, pen moving steadily across paper, that same unreadable smile waiting for him if he dared to look. The room stayed dark. He stood in the doorway one evening, longer than he meant to, taking in the stillness of it. Her chair, her books, the small portrait of the children she kept on the side table. Everything exactly as she'd left it, exactly as if she intended to come back, or exactly as if she didn't care enough anymore to take it with her. He wasn't sure which thought unsettled him more. For the first time in 11 months, Xavier Lancaster stood alone in his own house and felt, sharply and without warning, the full weight of a wing gone empty. It would be 3 more weeks before he understood just how much else was about to follow her out the door. The first sign was the tenant farmers, 3 of them arrived at Lancaster Hall within the same week, hats in hand, asking about repairs that should have been scheduled months ago. A collapsed fence line, a leaking roof on the grain store, a dispute over boundary stones that Catherine had always settled before it reached Xavier's desk at all. "Where's the Duchess?" one of them asked bluntly. "She always sorted this out." Xavier had no good answer. He gave vague instructions to the steward and sent the men away, irritated, telling himself it was a small matter. It wasn't small for long. Within 2 weeks, the steward came to him directly, visibly anxious, holding a stack of papers he clearly didn't want to be holding. "Your Grace, several accounts are past reconciliation. The Duchess kept records I can't fully make sense of. There are payments owed, payments received that aren't logged anywhere obvious, and I don't—" "Then sort it out," Xavier said, sharper than he meant. "I've tried, Your Grace. I don't understand her system." Nobody did. That was the problem. Catherine had run half the estate's practical machinery in her head, and in private ledgers nobody else had bothered to learn, because nobody had ever thought to ask how she did it. They'd simply enjoyed the result. Full granaries, paid staff, content tenants, without ever wondering whose hands kept it running. His mother's gambling debts surfaced next, no longer quietly contained. A creditor's letter arrived, demanding payment on a sum far larger than Xavier had any idea existed. And when he confronted her, she went pale and admitted Catherine had been managing it discreetly for over a year, moving small sums to cover the worst of it before it became a scandal. "You let my wife clean up your debts," Xavier said, voice low and furious, "and told no one." "She offered," his mother said weakly. "She said it was for the family's sake." For the family's sake. Catherine had been protecting a household that barely acknowledged her, and Xavier hadn't known a single thing about it. The household staff began to fracture next, small frictions that wouldn't have mattered before suddenly mattering enormously. A scheduling dispute between the cook and the housekeeper, normally resolved by Catherine within the hour, escalated into a standoff that lasted 3 days and ended with the housekeeper threatening to resign. The children's tutor quit outright, citing lack of structure in the household, a phrase that landed on Xavier like an accusation. Lady Genevieve, to her credit, or her ruin, was no help at all. She found the chaos tiresome. Her visits grew shorter. Her enthusiasm for Lancaster Hall, once so bright, dimmed considerably. Once it became clear the house required more than charm to keep functioning. "This place is falling apart," she said one evening, not unkindly, simply observing. How did Catherine manage all this? Xavier didn't answer. He was beginning to suspect the answer was better than you ever could. By the end of the month, the granary shipment had been delayed. 2 tenant disputes had escalated to formal complaints, and the household ran on a kind of barely controlled disorder that everyone could feel, but no one could name. Standing in his study late one night, surrounded by ledgers he couldn't decipher and letters demanding answers he didn't have, Xavier Lancaster finally allowed himself the thought he'd been avoiding for weeks. He hadn't lost an inconvenience. He'd lost the only person holding the entire estate together. Ashford was quiet, in a way Lancaster Hall had never been. Catherine's sister, Margaret, lived in a modest stone house at the edge of town, far from titles and gala gowns, and the particular exhaustion of being looked through instead of at. For the first week, Catherine slept more than she had in years. She ate without watching the door for who might walk in. She laughed, really laughed, at something Margaret's youngest said over breakfast, and the sound surprised her almost as much as it surprised the child. "You look 10 years younger," Margaret said one morning, studying her sister over a teacup. "I'd forgotten you could look like that." "So had I," Catherine admitted. She hadn't come to Ashford to hide. She'd come to think, properly, without an audience, without a household full of people who needed her to be invisible and competent in equal measure. And once the fog of exhaustion lifted, Catherine found herself doing something she hadn't done in over a decade, making plans for herself. She'd always had a talent for numbers, for organization, for seeing the shape of a problem before anyone else noticed it existed. At Lancaster Hall, that talent had been absorbed quietly into a marriage that took without acknowledging. In Ashford, it had nowhere to go but forward. She began consulting for a local merchant guild, untangling their accounts within days, the kind of work she'd done for Xavier's estate without thanks for years. Word spread fast in a town that small. Within a month, 3 more households had asked for her help. She charged for it now, properly, in her own name. Catherine Pembroke, one merchant said, signing a contract across her sister's kitchen table. I don't know how Lancaster Hall functioned before you. It didn't, Catherine said simply. Not really. She wrote to the children twice a week. Long, warm letters full of small jokes and questions about their days, careful never to involve Xavier in a single line. Eleanor's replies came back covered in ink blots and drawings, and Catherine kept every one of them in a drawer by her bed. She did not write to Xavier. Not once. It wasn't bitterness, not entirely. It was something closer to clarity. For 11 months she had organized her entire existence around being noticed by a man who'd stopped looking. In Ashford, with no one to perform for, she discovered she liked who she was without him watching. She bought a small house of her own 3 weeks in. Modest, with a garden she planted herself, hands in the dirt for the first time since she was a girl. She slept there some nights, just to feel what it was like to belong to no one's schedule but her own. Margaret found her in the garden one evening, kneeling in the soil, smiling at nothing in particular. You're different, Margaret said. I'm the same, Catherine corrected, sitting back on her heels. I just finally have room to be it. She thought of Lancaster Hall sometimes, the ledgers, the tenants, the quiet machinery she'd built and maintained for over a decade. She wondered, idly, how long it would take before someone noticed all of it was gone. She didn't have to wonder long. The first letter from the estate's steward arrived within the month, polite and increasingly desperate, asking if she might advise, even briefly, on a matter concerning the tenant accounts. Catherine read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it aside. She wasn't ready to go back, but for the first time in years, she liked knowing she was the one being asked. Xavier hadn't planned to go to Ashford. He told himself the trip was business, a meeting with a grain merchant his steward couldn't reach by letter. It was, in part, true. The rest of the truth he kept buried somewhere he didn't examine too closely. He saw her before she saw him. Catherine stood outside a modest stone house, sleeves rolled, hands in the soil of a small garden, laughing at something her sister's daughter said. Sunlight caught her hair. She looked nothing like the woman who'd sat composed and silent at the head of his table for 11 months. She looked lighter, younger, like a weight had been lifted clean off her shoulders the moment she crossed the county line. He hadn't seen her look like that in years. He wasn't certain he'd ever seen her look like that at all. Xavier, his name in her mouth, stopped him cold. She'd risen, wiping her hands on her apron, expression unreadable. Not cold, not warm, simply composed in a way that unsettled him more than anger would have. Catherine, he cleared his throat. I didn't expect. To find me gardening? A small smile. Neither did I. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. It had felt longer. It had felt, to Xavier, like an entire season of his life had quietly fallen apart while he wasn't looking. The children miss you, he said, because it was true, and because he didn't know how else to start. I miss them too. I write twice a week. I know. Eleanor reads me parts of your letters. He hesitated. She doesn't read me all of them. No, Catherine agreed. She wouldn't. A silence stretched between them, neither hostile nor comfortable. Behind her, Margaret's daughter called out something about supper, and Catherine glanced back briefly. The easy familiarity of it, landing on Xavier like a small, unexpected blow. She had a whole life here, a life that didn't require him at all. The estate, he started, then stopped, hating how it sounded, as though he'd come for the ledgers and not for her. It's struggling, Catherine. The tenants, the accounts. I didn't realize how much you carried, she finished, not unkindly. I know. The steward writes to me weekly. You knew, and you didn't come back. I wasn't asked to come back, she said. I was asked to advise. Briefly, like a consultant you'd forgotten you employed. The words landed precisely where she meant them to. Xavier looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't in longer than he wanted to admit, and saw, for the first time, not his wife waiting to be noticed, but a woman who had built something entirely her own, out of the wreckage he'd handed her. I came to ask you to come home, he said quietly. Not to advise, to come home. Catherine studied him for a long moment, garden soil still under her fingernails, the late afternoon light softening the hard line of his jaw. Why now, Xavier? After 11 months of nothing, why does this matter now? He didn't have an easy answer. He had a true one. Because the house has been empty since you left it, he said. And I only just noticed how long it's actually been empty before that. Catherine said nothing for a long while. Then, quietly, that's not a reason I can build anything on. She turned back toward the garden, leaving him standing at the gate, with far more to think about than he'd arrived with. Lord Edmund Hale had built half his fortune on knowing exactly what other people overlooked. He met Catherine Pembroke at the Merchant Guild's quarterly meeting in Ashford, where she'd been invited to review 3 households' tangled accounts in a single afternoon. He watched her untangle a ledger that had stumped his own accountant for weeks, doing it calmly, without fuss, correcting errors as she went without making anyone in the room feel foolish for having made them. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked afterward, genuinely curious. "Necessity," Catherine said. "I ran an estate for 11 years. Nobody noticed until I stopped." Edmund noticed immediately. He was nothing like Xavier, older by a decade, unhurried, the kind of man who'd made his money slowly and respected anyone who understood the value of patience. He didn't flatter her. He simply listened, asked good questions, and treated her opinion as the most useful thing in the room. Within 2 weeks, he'd hired her formally to reorganize his estate's finances, paying her a sum that made Margaret raise her eyebrows over breakfast. Within a month, he'd begun finding reasons to visit Ashford more often than business required. "You undervalue yourself," he told her once, watching her work through a column of figures by lamplight. "You did the work of an entire estate office for years, and no one thought to pay you for it, let alone thank you." It wasn't about thanks, Catherine said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "It should have been," Edmund said. "It still should be." He was careful, deliberate, never overstepping, but the attention was unmistakable, and Catherine, who had spent 11 months being looked through, found she didn't entirely mind being looked at. Word reached Lancaster Hall the way word always did, through staff, through guild gossip, through a careless mention at a dinner Xavier attended without enthusiasm. "Lord Hale," the senator's wife said, delighted to be the one delivering it, "has taken quite an interest in your wife's talents, Your Grace. Financial talents, of course, though I hear he's rather taken with her company besides." Xavier said nothing, which the senator's wife seemed to enjoy even more than an answer would have. He found himself thinking about Edmund Hale more than he cared to admit. A man with money, patience, and apparently the good sense to recognize what had been sitting in his own house for over a decade. The thought sat badly in his chest, sharper than he expected. He wrote to Catherine, a simple letter, asking after the children, asking nothing about Edmund Hale at all, though the absence of the question was its own kind of admission. Her reply came a week later, polite, brief, mentioning that Lord Hale had been remarkably generous with his time and his confidence in her work. Xavier read that line more times than he'd admit to anyone. For the first time since the gala, he understood with total clarity that Catherine Pembroke was not waiting for him to notice her. Someone else already had, and unlike him, Edmund Hale hadn't needed 11 months and a collapsing estate to figure out what she was worth. Eleanor stopped eating properly the week her mother left, though it took Xavier nearly a month to notice the pattern, and the nursemaid longer still to say anything aloud. "She asks for the Duchess every night," the nursemaid finally admitted, wringing her hands in the study doorway. "Won't settle without it. The boys are quieter about it, but I think it's the same. Xavier's elder son, Thomas, 12, and trying hard to seem unaffected, had taken to spending hours in the stable instead of his lessons. When pressed, he gave nothing away, just a tight jaw and a shrug that reminded Xavier uncomfortably of himself. "I'm fine," Thomas said, the same lie his father had been telling for weeks. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence, climbing into Xavier's lap one evening, with the directness only a 6-year-old could manage. "When is Mother coming home?" "I don't know," Xavier admitted, because lying to her felt suddenly, unbearably wrong. "Did you make her go?" The question landed harder than any accusation an adult had thrown at him in weeks. "No," he said. "I didn't make her go. I just didn't give her a reason to stay." Eleanor considered this with the serious face she reserved for important matters. "You should give her one now." He didn't have a good answer for a 6-year-old, which told him everything about how poor his answers had been for everyone else. The following week, Catherine's letters arrived as always, but this time, Thomas asked to read his own aloud at dinner. 3 pages about her work with Lord Hale's accounts, a funny story about Margaret's daughter, and at the very end, a single line: "Tell your father the tenant disputes in the East Field were never about the fence. Tell him to ask the right question." Xavier read that line a dozen times. It wasn't addressed to him directly. It was a message routed through his own son, because she still didn't trust him enough to write it plainly. He deserved that, and he knew it. The children began asking to visit Ashford. Xavier resisted at first, telling himself it complicated things, until Thomas finally said what no one else had dared to. "You're not protecting us by keeping her away. You're protecting yourself from seeing what we already know." 12 years old, and entirely right. He arranged the visit within the week. Catherine met them at Margaret's gate, and the moment Eleanor saw her, she ran the last stretch of road without waiting for the carriage to stop completely, throwing herself into her mother's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Thomas followed more slowly, but the relief on his face was unmistakable, the stiff shoulders finally dropping when his mother pulled him into the embrace too. Xavier stood back, watching his children cling to a woman they hadn't seen properly in 2 months, and understood with brutal clarity that whatever fracture had occurred in his marriage, no fracture existed between Catherine and her children. None at all. If anything, distance had only sharpened how desperately they wanted her near. "They've missed you," he said quietly, once the children had run off toward Margaret's garden. "I've missed them too." Catherine watched them go, her expression softening in a way it never quite did around him anymore. "They're the only part of that house I never doubted." It wasn't an accusation. It didn't need to be. Xavier understood, watching her, that his children had already made a choice he hadn't even realized was being offered, and they hadn't chosen him. Xavier sold his favorite hunting estate within the month, a property his father had left him, the one piece of land Xavier had always considered untouchable. He used the proceeds to settle his mother's debts in full, quietly, without ceremony, the way Catherine had been doing for over a year without anyone's gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," his mother said, more shaken than grateful. "I should have done it months ago," Xavier said, "before Catherine had to do it for me, without my knowing." He ended things with Lady Genevieve the same week, plainly, without cruelty, but without leaving room for misunderstanding either. "I assumed this was coming," Genevieve said, more amused than wounded. "You've been somewhere else for weeks, Xavier. Honestly, I think you have been since the gala." She wasn't wrong. He spent the following weeks doing the unglamorous work Catherine had carried invisibly for years, learning the tenant ledgers himself, meeting personally with the farmers whose fences and roofs had gone unattended, sitting through hours of accounts with the steward until the numbers finally made sense to him, the way they'd apparently always made sense to her. It was humbling work. He was bad at it, slow, prone to the kind of mistakes Catherine had clearly never made, and the steward's patient corrections stung more than he expected. "The Duchess used to do this in half the time," the steward said once, not unkindly, simply stating fact. "I know," Xavier said. "I'm trying to understand how." He visited the East Field himself. The dispute Catherine's letter had mentioned, the one everyone assumed was about a fence. It wasn't. It was about water rights, an old boundary the previous duke had quietly mishandled decades earlier, the kind of buried problem only someone who actually listened to tenants would ever uncover. Catherine had known. She'd known for years, and managed it diplomatically, without ever needing credit. He resolved it properly this time, in writing, with both farmers present, the way it should have been handled from the start. He wrote to Catherine more honestly after that, not asking her to come home, not yet, simply telling her what he'd done and why. No demands, no expectations, just an accounting of a man trying, badly and sincerely, to become someone worth listening to. Her replies grew slightly longer, still careful, still guarded, but no longer empty. He began attending the children's lessons in her absence, learning Thomas's stubborn pride and Eleanor's particular fears in a way he'd never bothered to before, when noticing his own children had simply seemed like Catherine's job rather than his. "You're different," Thomas said one evening, suspicious but not unkind. "I'm trying to be," Xavier admitted. "It's slower than I expected." Word of the changes reached Ashford the way everything did, through staff, through letters, through Margaret's careful, pointed updates to her sister over dinner. Catherine said little when she heard. She'd learned, painfully, not to mistake a man's effort for a man's character, until enough time had passed to prove the difference. But she noticed. She couldn't help noticing. Lord Hale noticed too, watching her read Xavier's letters with an expression he couldn't quite name. "He's trying," Edmund said carefully, one evening, watching her fold the latest one. "Yes," Catherine admitted. "For the first time in 11 years, he actually is." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was, for the first time, the beginning of something Xavier hadn't earned in months of marriage. Catherine's genuine, cautious attention. The province's autumn assembly was the second largest gathering of the year, and everyone who'd witnessed the gala humiliation made certain to attend, hungry for whatever chapter came next in the Lancaster scandal. Catherine almost didn't go. Margaret convinced her otherwise. "You built half your reputation in that ballroom for 11 years, Margaret said. "Let them see what you built since." She arrived in deep blue, not emerald this time, her own choice, her own color, nothing borrowed from anyone's approval. Lord Hale escorted her, not as a declaration, but because he'd been invited as a guild representative, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The room noticed anyway. The room always noticed. Xavier saw her the moment she entered, and something in his chest tightened in a way he'd grown almost used to over the past months. The senator's wife, predictably, found her within minutes. "Your Grace, we'd heard you were away. Consulting, is it? How charming, finding a little hobby." "Managing 3 estates' finances," Catherine corrected pleasantly, "including Lord Hale's. It's been quite involved." 3 estates. The senator's wife's smile faltered slightly. 4, as of last week, Edmund added, with the easy confidence of a man stating fact. "Lady Pembroke is the most sought-after financial mind in the province. I consider myself fortunate she had time for mine." It rippled through the room exactly as intended. Not gossip this time, but genuine reassessment. The particular shift that occurred when a woman they'd dismissed as background suddenly became impossible to ignore. Xavier crossed the floor, the way he had at the gala, but the room watched differently this time. Less anticipation of cruelty, more curiosity about what might actually be said. "Catherine," Xavier, even composed, not cold. "The Eastfield dispute," he said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. "It's resolved. Properly. The way it should have been years ago, if I'd bothered to ask the right questions. It wasn't flattery. It was an admission, delivered publicly, in the same room where he'd once let her walk out unacknowledged." "I heard," Catherine said. "The tenants seem pleased." "They are. No thanks to me being quick about it." He held her gaze. "Thanks to you, originally, for knowing what the actual problem was for years, and never once being asked." The senator's wife, sensing the conversation had slipped entirely out of scandal territory, drifted away in search of better material. Lady Genevieve, watching from across the room with a glass of wine and considerably less interest than before, simply raised her glass slightly toward Catherine. Not quite an apology, but close enough to one. "You've changed how you speak about this," Catherine said quietly, once they were alone enough to speak honestly. "I've changed how I see it," Xavier said. 11 months too late. "I know that." Catherine studied him a long moment, the noise of the assembly rising around them, the same room that had watched her humbled, now watching something else entirely unfold. "It's a start," she said finally, "not an ending." It was the most generous thing she'd offered him since the gala, and judging by the look on his face, he knew exactly how much it cost her to say it. Winter came early that year, dusting Lancaster Hall's grounds in frost by the time Xavier finally asked the only question that mattered. He didn't ask it at a gala, or in front of witnesses, or with any of the ceremony their marriage had once demanded. He drove out to Ashford himself, alone, and found Catherine in her garden, wrapped in a heavy shawl, tending the last of the season's herbs before the frost took them. "You're going to ruin your hands doing that in this cold," he said, by way of greeting. "They've survived worse," Catherine said, not looking up. He sat on the low stone wall beside the garden, uninvited but not unwelcome, watching her work in silence for a while, before he spoke again. "I'm not here to ask you to come home because the estate needs you," he said. "It does. I won't pretend otherwise. But that's not why I'm here." Catherine sat back on her heels, studying him. "Then why?" "Because I spent 11 months looking past you for things that meant nothing, and 3 more learning everything you'd quietly built while I wasn't looking. The accounts, the tenants, the children, all of it. You ran an estate and a marriage I barely showed up for, and I called it nothing because I never thought to call it anything at all." "That's an apology for the past," Catherine said carefully. "Not a reason for the future." "I know." He met her eyes. "The reason is simpler than that. I love you. Not the version of you that managed my house without complaint. You, the one who left, and built something entirely her own, and made me realize I'd married a woman I never actually bothered to know." Catherine said nothing for a long moment, the cold settling between them, the garden quiet, except for the wind moving through bare branches. "Lord Hale has been kind to me," she said finally, patient. "He's never once made me feel invisible." "I know." Xavier's voice was steady, though it cost him. "I won't ask you to choose between us on the strength of what I've done in 3 months, against what he's done consistently for longer. I'm only asking you to choose based on what you actually want. Not obligation, not duty. Want." It was, perhaps, the first time in their entire marriage he'd asked her that question directly. Catherine rose slowly, brushing soil from her knees, and studied him for a long, unhurried moment. The man who'd once looked through her, now looking, finally, like he saw her completely. "I want my children to grow up watching their parents actually choose each other," she said. "Not perform it, choose it." "Then let me choose you properly," Xavier said. "Every day. Not because the house falls apart without you, because I do." She didn't answer immediately. She walked to him slowly, the frost crunching softly beneath her boots, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the practiced emptiness from the gala, none of the polite distance from the months after. "Then come home with me," she said. "Properly. Both of us, this time." The wedding ring she'd never stopped wearing caught the pale winter light as he took her hand. Lancaster Hall's west wing was lit again before spring. Warm, full, alive with the sound of children's laughter, and a marriage finally built on being seen, not simply endured. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely. You didn't have to stay, but you did, and that means everything to this channel. If Catherine's story moved you, please like this video. It tells me to keep going. Subscribe to Duke Tales by Mia if you haven't, hit the bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below. I want to know where you're watching from. Your city, your country, wherever you are in the world right now. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story. Take care.